in the Indic traditions, provided they receive a good grounding in the tradition through competent instructors. We also need to acknowledge that not all instructors are trained in original texts and lack specialized language skills like Sanskrit, for instance. Even when they are very well meaning, they are not able to bring the richness of a particular concept to the attention of the student. For instance, Dharma, for instance, is derived from the root dhr, meaning to support, sustain, to behave in a manner that conforms to ideal human behavior, etc. But this is a very late explanation and does not figure in earlier texts to the best of my knowledge. We all know that the word dharma or dharman occurs in the Vedas in the sense of ritual as also the result that accrues from the performance of ritual. But by the time of the Upanishads, we find that dharma has assumed great importance and rita has faded into the background. How this change came into being is not very clear. But dharma has added new meanings along with what was denoted by rita. While rita was an external reality capable of being realized by correct performance of yajna, dharma was the code of conduct for earning abhyudaya or a good life here on earth. The earliest attempt to define dharma as something which is a mental activity occurs in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. The origin of dharma described in the Brihadaranyaka in the following episode points to the inner dimension of dharma. Brahman, after creating all the 4 varnas, says the Upanishad, was still not happy and then fulfilled itself by projecting dharma. Further, the Upanishad identifies dharma with satya, thus affirming the moral virtue of truth embedded in dharma. This is mentioned specifically within the context of a kshatriya who represents the ruler and points to a higher principle or dharma by which the king rules, namely Raja Dharma. Shankara tellingly comments that dharma rules even the ruler. It is thus something right, implanted internally, which guides human conduct to do the right thing. And in the very next passage, the Brihadaranyaka extends the notion of dharma to the fulfillment of one's obligations, not only to the 3 rinas, Brahma, Deva, and Pitru rinas, but also to one's fellow beings and to all living beings, which is called the Panchayatnas. The Upanishad thus makes the point that one's behavior is to be correct, not only towards other fellow beings, but it has to extend to animals, beasts, birds, and even ants. Built into this is the ethics of compassion and sympathy for all that inhabits the world and recalls the holistic vision of the Vedas. By leading a life of dharma, we are told that one attains abhyudaya in the world and liberation after death. The Vaisheshika Sutras echoes that when it says dharma is that which leads to both abhyudaya and nishreyasa. Dharma absorbed not only the properties assigned to rita, but also some of the other Vedic ideas, such as a holistic vision given expression to in the Purusha Sukta and the funeral hymn, for instance. In literature and the performing arts and in general practice, it is the Vedic idea of holism and interconnectedness that gained prominence as witnessed in the following examples. An insult to Surabhi, the Kamadhenu, results in Dilipa and Sudakshina being deprived of an offspring so beautifully described in Kalidasa's Raghuvamsha. Dushyanta's fear of ashrama trees in Kanva's ashrama not bearing fruits because of some lapse on his part is given voice to in the Abhijnana Shakuntalam of Kalidasa. The act of asking for forgiveness from Mother Earth by a classical dancer before she starts performing because of her trampling on Mother Earth is the very first item called the Mangalacharanam in Odissi dance. Every individual is also instructed to bow down to Mother Earth and ask for forgiveness before stepping off the bed after sleeping every morning. Samudravasane Devi, Parvatastala Mandale, Vishnupatni Namastubhyam, Padasparsham, Kshamaswame. Vyasa has battled with the concept of dharma in his Mahabharata, which is a cultural text where he has depicted the multi-dimensional character of Dharma and the different human responses to it in life situations. The Mahabharata defines Dharma in one place as Dharyate iti Dharma, how one supports oneself. It also gives other definitions, and Vyasa does not seem to be totally satisfied with any of them. Gregory Bailey has pointed to these different approaches to Dharma in the Mahabharata and rightly concludes that Dharma exists, yet it must still be interpreted. And at many places, the Mahabharata also makes the connection of the conduct of the good, bringing back the world to its virtuous path when it has fallen from Dharma, which reminds us of the Rita aspect of Dharma. Vyasa also mentions that one should desire for others what one desires for oneself, and one should not do something which is unpleasant to oneself to others. Faced with different situations in life, both men and women characters in the Mahabharata had to make their dharmic choices in the way they could best approximate to the dictates of Dharma. This fits in with the meaning of Dharma that Matilal gives, I quote, code of conduct agreed upon and observed by a particular group of community, unquote. And one can surmise that the code of conduct was arrived at after many trials and tribulations in the lived world. Since there was no one way of defining Dharma, we come across many situational dharmas in the Mahabharata, as Matilal calls them, when characters decide after due consideration what is the best dharmic behavior in a particular situation. The Mahabharata perhaps best represents the multi-layered character of Dharma. The epic presents us with characters as varied as Yudhishthira, Duryodhana, Drona, Bhishma, Vikarna, Kunti, Draupadi, etc., whose actions cannot fit into a standard dharma as there is no standard dharma. The different characters in the Mahabharata enable us to understand our own predicaments in the world. Let us look at one of these characters, Kunti. Two women are crucially connected to the progress of the Mahabharata story. One is Satyavati, the matron of the Kaurava branch of the Kuru clan, and the other is Kunti as the matriarch of the Pandava branch. Kunti's story is pathetic from start to finish. She gives birth by all accounts to an illegitimate child by Surya, Karna, and had to abandon him by letting him float on the river. The birth was made possible through the efficacy of the mantra that Durvasa gave her, pleased with the way she looked after him as a guest in her father's palace. Kunti's behavior has been discussed in a moral conduct, thank you very much. But the question of whether it was ethical for Durvasa to give Kunti the mantra to enable her to conceive has not been discussed generally. After all, a rishi of the caliber of Durvasa should have known how his boon could corrupt a young girl's mind. If indeed he did have ascetic powers, as is claimed, he should have been able to foresee what would be the consequences of his giving this boon to Kunti in the first place. In fact, Kunti herself mentions how her curiosity in the Udyoga Parvan, how her curiosity to test the efficacy of the mantra and her anxiety to avoid censure both to herself and her family made her take the extreme step of giving up Karna. So was Kunti wrong in satisfying her adolescent curiosity, or was Durvasa to be faulted for giving Kunti the mantra in the first place? Knowing fully well the heavy price that society placed on virginity in women till the time of marriage, by all accounts, Durvasa cannot be excused for giving her the mantra and has to share a large part of the blame for this predicament. Ethical conduct that is constrained by societal pressures is very much a fact even today. It is the fear of censure of an unwed mother giving birth to a child that compels Kunti to abandon her newborn child, and Durvasa cannot be absolved for his part in the situation. Later, when Kunti approaches Karna before the battle to appeal to him to change sides, Karna taunts her by saying that even an enemy would not have harmed him as much as Kunti did by abandoning him. He further points out that she had not behaved towards him as a mother should, and it was only because she was afraid that the Pandavas would be defeated by him in battle that she was approaching him now. Was this a fair criticism of Kunti? Keeping the conventional norms of society, it would be difficult for Kunti to have nurtured Karna herself. Here is a moral dilemma which was won by societal convention. This is brought out clearly when even at this juncture, both Kunti and Sri Krishna do not reveal the identity of Karna to the wider world, but only to Karna himself. It is mentioned that Karna did not want his identity revealed to the Pandavas themselves, as Yudhishthira would have given up his claim to the throne in favor of Karna. The message of the Mahabharata is also to bring to our attention that societal pressures can make humans behave in unnatural ways, and so may be a caution to respect those conventions or pay the price for the lapses. After all, many such situations do arise, even today, forcing one very often to bow down to societal pressure, and it is a rare, courageous individual who can stand up to collective social pressure. The Mahabharata presents Yudhishthira as an acme of moral rectitude, and yet Vyasa makes a mongoose belittle his dharma as far inferior to that of a poor Brahmin's dharma in the Ashwamedhika Parva. Throughout the Mahabharata, Vyasa injects his main story with minor interludes such as that of the mongoose to emphasize that there is always another side to the dharma picture. We see him belittle sage Kaushika's adherence to truth by denying him entry to Swarga. It is ahimsa paramo dharma and that trumps in this case. One would have thought that truth was being advocated as the highest dharma, and yet when that dharma resulted in the killing of the robber, it did not merit the highest reward for Kaushika. In the story of Uttanga, he is denied immortality for refusing to drink water offered in the stream of the urine of a hunter who was in fact Indra himself. Such juxtapositioning the sublime with the ridiculous highlights Vyasa's reflections on dharma. Can anyone ever lead a perfect dharmic life? Is the question posed and answered by Vyasa himself when he ends the Mahabharata with the statement Urdu Bahor Viraumesha. I leave out the Sanskrit. The translation is, with uplifted arms I cry aloud, but no one hears me. Both Artha and Kama proceed from Dharma. So why is it that Dharma is not obeyed or followed? And answers it with the equally profound statement that the truth of Dharma is hidden in the cave. Vyasa's tragic hero, Karna, is everyone's story. Who has not faced moral dilemmas and have had to make some decision based on the exigencies of the moment in their own lives? Let us move on to the way that oral traditions have kept alive the Dharma paradigm in the consciousness of the common person. There is this moving tale of a South Indian king called Pari who on one of his visits saw a jasmine creeper full of flowers lying on the ground without any support. His two daughters were with him, and they all felt personal grief at the helpless state of the creeper where it could be trampled upon by all and sundry. So they got down from the chariot and together propped up the creeper to the royal chariot as support for it and went back home on foot. In another tale belonging to the Chola times, the Dharmic king is supposed to be available at all times to the public, and for that purpose, a bell was available for anyone to summon the king about any injustice done. One day, a cow started pulling the rope and ringing the bell. When the king found that its calf had been crushed to death by the royal chariot, the king is supposed to have sacrificed his own child by the same means. One does not question the veracity or otherwise of these tales, but accepts the underlying dharmic message conveyed. It is such stories that have etched the dharma concept in the psyche of the common person over the centuries. Let me now wear my other... How much time do you have? Okay, great. Let me now wear my other hat as a researcher and share with you a couple of ideas. One is familiar with the debate as to whether the insider's perception of a religion and tradition is more authentic than that of an outsider. This debate can never be resolved to everyone's satisfaction. I want to present before you a couple of examples where this question of the insider versus outsider question is pertinent. A number of my non-Indian friends who are scholars of Hindu studies have devoted their entire scholarly pursuit in the cause of understanding Hinduism, and what I am saying is in no way minimizing their important contributions to furthering the understanding of Hinduism. Since I have been engaged in translating some philosophical Shastric works, I have come across examples where understanding the ethos and culture enables one to fully comprehend what the sutra and commentarial literature are talking about. Since every commentator believes, as Kunyuni Raja aptly remarked, that he is the one who's presenting the philosophy in keeping with the original Sutrakara's intent, this transmission of meanings in a cultural context over a period of time also becomes important. Excuse me. Let me give you an example. I was once writing about the concept of Eka Jiva, which occurs in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. Vyasa was explaining the way a jiva transmigrates from one life to another, and in that context, the Yoga Sutra mentions that all the karmas of the individual come together and results in one birth, which is called Eka Jiva in the Yoga Sutras. It was obvious that Eka Jiva here refers to the very next birth of the individual, and that is exactly how a couple of my Indian Sanskrit French scholars understood it. On the other hand, two of my very erudite Western Sanskrit scholars would not admit that it referred to the very next birth, but just another birth. It is here that, as Jamieson remarks, the cultural context kicks in, and in certain words and concepts have special meanings for those within a tradition and culture. Jamieson uses the example of the word porridge, that having special resonance for the British to explain this phenomenon. Another word which baffled me was ghatika, which today is normally translated as a clock in Sanskrit. And some of my friends, both Indian and Western, have translated it as such. But that makes no sense in a Shastra work which did not have a modern clock or watch to measure time when it was written. The words used for measure there are many, like manam, kala, mitihi, amshaha, and also ghatika. It took me a while to understand that ghatika is the water wheel that turns in a field for irrigation, and that was what the Bhashyakara was talking about. The Eastern traditions and Hinduism as the oldest of them, they all have a number of these words whose meanings can be fully comprehended only as part of an overall cultural context. Though this is not directly connected to the Dharma topic, I still thought one needs to ponder over this question. Concluding, some people critique Dharma as a free-for-all, as it is not based on any standard and is contextual. But as Matilal mentions, even though there is a certain malleability in the application of our practical wisdom, it does not mean that the fixity and universality of ethical laws will be entirely negotiable. One need not also fear that Dharma lacks objectivity. There has been a recognition of what is known as positional objectivity in philosophical circles today. As Ganeri states, I quote, "Little remains now of the 19th century conception of the requirements of objectivity as calling for a complete elimination of interest or perspective. What counts as objectivity is that the situated interpreter achieves positional objectivity in his or her interpretations, and second, that immersed interpretation is positionally objective to the extent that the interpreter's situation is one of participation rather than observation," unquote. This is just a restatement of the situational dharma that Matilal talked about and which we have alluded to earlier. Traditionally, there were also guidelines provided by Varnashrama dharmas and Sadharana dharmas, and an overwritten convention that dharma alone saves while adharma leads one to ruin. Dharmo rakshati rakshataha. within which one had the freedom to act within the canopy of dharma. We can compare dharma ethics to the freedom of speech and freedom to seek one's own identity or destiny enshrined in many democratic constitutions today. While one has the freedom of speech, one needs to remember that it is automatically circumscribed by the freedom of the others as well to the same right. The capacity to decide what is right and what is wrong in any situation is a difficult ethical one. Thus, dharma is a double-edged weapon or sword. Even while negotiating the best dharmic path in a given situation, one needs to also take into consideration the basic dharma of preserving the other's right to dharma as well. No wonder the literature on moral philosophy is something which has no closure. It is because the Mahabharata brings out this dichotomous nature of dharma to the forefront. It is because of his concern for the other person at all times that we find Yudhishthira depicted as the most dharmic person in the Mahabharata. While the best exemplar of dharmic conduct in the Mahabharata is Yudhishthira himself, it is the other characters who in their struggles while coping in the world represent the many-sidedness of virtue and vice in this great epic. The Mahabharata seems to hold the view that if tutored in the high value of upholding dharma, the agent, when faced with ethical issues, will be able to make the best choice under the given circumstances, even though, as stated above,